Hi, welcome everyone. My name is Deborah Schaefer-Seaman. I am RAVSAK's Network Weaver. Today is February 24th, 2016, and we have with us Dr. Yoni Schwab. Dr. Schwab is going to give us an insider's look at ADHD, and I'm going to just review some quick technical information with you guys and then pass the mic over to Gussie Singer, and I'll tell you about her in just a moment. At the bottom of your screen, for all of you Zoom users, you'll see a microphone. Please go ahead and use that microphone to mute yourself. If you're just calling in by phone, go ahead and mute your own phone line as well. That way we won't hear you while you're enjoying your lunch and Dr. Schwab is talking. Anybody who is able to be on video, we would love to have you on video. And if you'd like to ask any questions at all while Dr. Schwab is talking, please feel free to put them in the chat box. There's a chat function at the bottom of your screen. Just click that. You can write to me privately, Deborah Schaefer-Seaman, or if you need tech support, write to RAVSAK Tech Support privately. Otherwise, questions can go out to the group. You'll just click on everyone and chat in that box. I'm going to pass the baton over to Gussie Singer. Gussie is the volunteer facilitator of RAVSAK's Learning Specialist Reshet. And it is truly, truly a pleasure to work with her, a pleasure to have her with us today. So Gussie, I'm going to pass the mic over to you so that you can introduce Dr. Schwab.
Thank you, Deborah. A clinical psychologist, Yoni served as the psychologist at the Windward School and on the faculty of the Windward Teaching Training Institute. He is an adjunct clinical supervisor at Furkhoff Graduate School of Yeshiva University, and has had successful private clinical practices in Riverdale and Scarsdale. Yoni conducts research, consults, and lectures extensively on social emotional language, progressive behavior management, and raising the achievement of students with behavioral and learning challenges. He serves on the expert panel of Parents.com, the website of Parents Magazine. Yoni holds BAs from both Columbia University and the Jewish Theological Seminary, and earned his doctorate in clinical psychology at Rutgers University. He also trained at the NYU Child Study Center in the treatment of ADHD and disruptive behavior, and at the Institute for Behavior Therapy. Prior to his career in psychology, Yoni was a management and development consultant to Jewish and Israeli nonprofits at Perry Davis Associates. He lives in Riverdale with his wife Jessica, a second grade teacher, and their 3 children who attend SAR Academy.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me all right. What's actually not in that bio, because it came from our school website, is that I'm the assistant head of the Shefa School, which is a new Jewish day school for kids with language-based learning disabilities right here in New York City. So that's what I'm doing with most of my time, although I also serve as a psychologist here. I'm doing lots of other things too. And I have to say this is my first time on Zoom, but as my kids are at SAR, my 7th grader uses it like every day. So he's probably, so if I make mistakes, I'm sorry. I should have asked him in advance how to use it properly. All right, so I want to jump right into it because ADHD is a topic that we now have 53 minutes to talk about. That's impossible to discuss in any kind of like thoughtful way in that short a period of time. And I'm going to talk about ADHD in I like to do things practically. Obviously, everyone's here because they have to deal with ADHD in the classroom every day. But my approach always is to take a step back and to say, what's the kind of the essence of what's going on? Because anyone can come up with there have been books that list out all of the different accommodations and interventions that you can use for ADHD, but I find that they don't cohere unless you kind of really have an idea of what's going on in the kid's brain and what they're thinking about. And I'm not going to talk about the neurology too much, very, very little in fact, but kind of what's the psychology, kind of what's going on in the brain of that kid. And when we understand that, I think it's much, the kind of accommodations and the way that we support them become much clearer. So I hope everyone received the handouts that were emailed around. I hope you can nod. Hopefully you receive them. I'm also going to share my screen so that we'll go through them together. But hopefully you can take notes on them or what have you. I put far more slides, actually cut out many slides from this normal presentation that I do. But I also put way more slides than we're going to get to today. And that's because I hope that once we get to the core of what's going on with ADHD, you can then go and look at kind of the list of suggestions that flow from that that don't need as much explanation. So that's really my goal is to really focus on the essence. I also really like things. This is generally, but I like things that boil down to one basic idea or two basic ideas, because I think that's really something you can sink your teeth into and hold on to. And ADHD, in some ways, is that. There's a really one very basic idea that I'm going to propose. I didn't propose it. Russell Barkley proposed it. He's a famous professor that's really the lead researcher in ADHD in the world at the moment. That really, whenever I look at a kid with ADHD, if I can hold that one thing in my head, I can often understand how their behaviors and how their difficulties and how their strengths really flow from that one basic idea. That being said, one of my supervisors in ADHD is famous for saying the quote, "If you know with one kid with ADHD, then you know one kid with ADHD." So of course, I'm going to be talking in generalities here. Every kid is unique and different, and so much more so than this one particular kind of diagnosis or part of their personality. So this is obviously going to have to be tailored, and that's why I'm not going to get into, I'm not going to spend as much time on particular interventions. But if you can get a sense of where this kid's brain is coming from, hopefully the interventions will flow from there. And I've obviously kept many of those suggestions in at the end of this section. So without any further ado, any kind of opening questions before we get started? All right, let's get going. I put here just some fun quotes. People often question ADHD's existence. Is this a new thing? What the researchers love to point out is that this inquiry into the nature and origin of mental derangement that was published in London in 1798 has essentially a description of ADHD. A disease of attention, the incapacity of attending with a necessary degree of constancy to any one object, an unnatural degree of mental restlessness. And this could be written, if substitute the word Hebrew here. Every public teacher must have observed that there are many to whom the dryness and difficulties of the Latin and Greek grammars are so disgusting that neither the terrors of the rod nor the indulgence of any kind entreaty can cause them to give their attention to it. I think a great description, a 220-year-old description of ADHD. Another great one, sorry, I'm clicking here, the story of Fidgety Phil from 1845. Let me see if Philip can be a little gentleman. Let me see if he is able to sit still for once at a table. Thus Papa bade Phil behave, and Mama looked very grave. But Fidgety Phil, he won't sit still. He wriggles and giggles, and then I declare swings backwards and forwards and tilts up his chair just like a rocking horse. Again, if you ever ate dinner with a kid who was ADHD, particularly combined type or hyperactive impulsive type, you know Fidgety Phil. Let's talk about just what the DSM says about this. What the DSM says about ADHD, and then we're going to kind of put that aside. So in order to be diagnosed with ADHD, you need to have either 6 of the following 9 inattentive symptoms. These are the same symptoms, by the way, that were in DSM-4. They were not revised, although Russell Barkley and other experts encouraged them to be revised. So much research and so much effort has gone into the current diagnosis that people didn't want to mess with it. So for better or for worse, we're stuck with the same set of descriptors, same set of kind of external symptoms, which I don't think necessarily get to what's really going on. But to get the inattentive side, you need to have at least 6 of the following: difficulty paying close attention, careless mistakes, sustaining attention, not seem to listen when spoken to directly. You've kind of heard this list before. I think trouble organizing. Nod your head. Can you see my cursor? Okay, so like trouble organizing is actually it's a pretty good one in terms of figuring out yes or no is this kid over the line. Kids with ADHD tend to have a very difficult time organizing their materials and their time. This avoid and disliking sustained effort is also an interesting one that we'll come back to. On the hyperactive impulsive side, you can get 6 from the following 2 lists. So the hyperactive ones are squirmy, getting up from their seat, running and climbing, on the go, talking excessively. Even kids who can sit, they often talk and they keep talking and talking and talking. And then the impulsive symptoms. They blurt out answers. They have trouble waiting their turn. I think that's a really good one. And they interrupt or intrude on conversations. So what happens with this when you come into it's a clinical diagnosis. There's no blood test. There's no brain scan that's effective at this point. What happens is you look at each list in the office. You decide if they're clinically significant or not. And then I'm trying to get that light out of my background. And then you look at, if they met if they have 6 out of 9 or more on the intensive side, all right, then we're in this part. They have 6 or more in hyperactive impulsive, then they're that together would be combined type. So 6 or more hyperactive impulsive, 6 or more inattentive, combined type. Let's say you have a kid that only meets for the inattentive side, 6 out of 9. They don't have enough or they don't have any of the hyperactive impulsive. That's ADHD inattentive type. Notice the H is still there. That H has continued to be an ADHD even when there's no actual hyperactivity since 1980. That's been the standard. People still talk about ADD. It may make sense. It's not been the clinical term for 35 years. So that's the correct term according to the DSM. Let's say you don't meet the inattentive type, but you do have hyperactive impulsive symptoms, 6 or more. You're this ADHD hyperactive impulsive type. Now the reality is that in theory that looks very nice. This subtype does not exist. There are virtually no kids who fall into it, and if they do, it's only because they're compensating really well on the inattentive side. You have inattentive and combined are really the only two that you're going to see. So the other things you need to do in order to make this diagnosis, if you're a psychologist like me or a psychiatrist or a developmental pediatrician, is that the symptoms are inappropriate for developmental stage. They have to be present at least 6 months, present early on. This is a developmental disorder. This is not acquired. If you have some kind of mental, some kind of brain injury that you acquire at the age of 15 or even at the age of 10 and suddenly look like ADHD, that's not really what we're talking about here. It certainly could mimic these symptoms, but ADHD is developmental. It's really there from birth, but it kind of comes out at different ages. It's also not in one setting. It's got to be in multiple settings. If they're just having trouble paying attention in school, but otherwise function very well, you're not looking at ADHD. There's something else going on, probably with learning. This is the old number, 3 to 8% of children and 2 to 5% of adults meet criteria. The reality is that in America, only the last 10 years, before that, it was really below that or at this number. The numbers have ballooned and skyrocketed. And the reason for that, that's a whole other
story. It says mute my audio. I have unmute.
So I'm not going to go into why I think that is that we've had this ballooning of the diagnosis. The one thing I want to say about it, though, is that it's really developmental. So it's developmental and it's really on a bell curve. These are not a different kind. It's not like you're pregnant or you're not pregnant. It's not ADHD or not ADHD. Self-regulation and executive functioning, which are the traits that underlie ADHD, exist on a continuum. And, we're all on different points. I have a friend who is a nonprofit exec, and she's the kind of person who can sit down and say, you have a task for me, that's going to take me about 35 minutes, and I can order my day, and I know exactly what's going to do, and I'm going to cross it off my schedule. She has unusually high executive functioning. It makes me a little nauseous, but I like her anyway. And, me, I'm somewhere in the middle. We're all on that bell curve, and ADHD is just one end of the bell curve. And at some point, we have to cut a line and say, beyond this line, it's just impairing. They can't function this way without extra support. That's really all ADHD is. It's just one end of that bell curve. Where that line is drawn and what the environment is around where that line should be, that's where I think you get into why there's so many diagnoses at this point. But again, I'm going to punt that one to my next talk. Let's talk about other things about the development of ADHD. The hyperactive impulsive symptoms come up first. I know a number of you, I think, are early childhood educators. I mean, if you look at the description of ADHD, that's like a typical 4-year-old. And it's typical for 4-year-olds to do all those things to some extent. And the hyperactive impulsive symptoms, running around and being driven by a motor and bouncing and, that and having trouble with taking turns, all of that is very common in 3 to 6-year-olds. And the kids who are doing it really a lot are the ones that are going to end up being diagnosed probably later with ADHD. But the hyperactive impulsive symptoms, they settle down over time. By high school, they can sit. They might pay attention, but they can sit. The inattentive symptoms really kind of emerge later, but those are the ones more likely to persist. The biggest gap, if you look at the developmental curve between kids with ADHD and others, is in middle school. This is why you see so many diagnoses in like 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, because the kids, it's almost like there's 2 curves going on. I don't know if you can see my hands or not, but, there's kids who are developing on the typical trajectory, and the kids with ADHD are on a slower trajectory, and they're widening into middle school. After middle school, they start to narrow again. They may not ever cross, but middle school is really the biggest challenge. And middle school, for so many other reasons, is just a huge developmental challenge. So that's where these things really kind of burst into view. And certainly years leading up to middle school are where we see it as well. ADHD is typically chronic and stable. This is not something that is you totally grow out of. Certain things do certainly get better over time through development, but about 80% who are diagnosed as children continue to meet criteria in adolescence, and at least 65 to 80% who have ADHD in childhood have some impairment in adulthood, whether or not they still cross that line. What causes it? ADHD is one of the most genetic things that we know of. Contrary to a lot of popular myth, where a lot of people think that ADHD is caused by too much television watching and bad parenting and all that sort of thing, true ADHD, when well tested for, when diagnosed, seems to be about 80% genetic. And let me give you a comparison. Depression and schizophrenia are about 60% genetic. The only thing that really exceeds ADHD is height. Height is about 90% genetic. So we're talking about something that's highly inherited. The exceptions are that you can have some very early on, usually during pregnancy, some kind of brain injury. Could be exposure to alcohol and tobacco, could be very early, like around by the age of 2, high lead levels, the whole lead thing going on in Flint. You've got, I would assume that they're going to test for this because this is a known problem, but the likelihood of a huge spike in ADHD when the little kids who are drinking that water with lead get to be, middle school and high school, I think it's going to be a tremendous problem because that seems to damage the areas of the brain that really are needed for good functioning in terms of ADHD. Low birth weight, some kind of injury to the prefrontal cortex, usually in utero and young ages, can also cause ADHD. But most of the time it's genetic. What does not cause it? They've tested these things, additives. If we talk about food, if a kid has an allergy and they're taking food that there's their allergy and they're not feeling well, or they have a gluten intolerance, a real gluten intolerance, they will have trouble paying attention. But that doesn't mean it causes ADHD. That's trouble paying attention secondary to having an allergy and feeling badly. The thing about attention that's so difficult to diagnose is that anything that goes wrong in your life, you're anxious, your dog died, your father's went on a business trip and you really miss him, you got in a fight at recess, any of those things cause you not to pay attention. So in order to make a good diagnosis, you essentially have to eliminate everything else. My own daughter suffers from, or did suffer from, luckily she's growing out of, absence seizures, which are these invisible seizures. And people thought she had ADHD because she wasn't paying attention. They actually test her hearing also, but she was having seizures. So again, there's so many things that have to be ruled out to say, you know what, we think this is a core attentional difficulty. Those social influences do affect a lot of functioning around the ADHD, but not the presence of the actual trait. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on brains, but here they have identified the parts of the brain that are less functional in kids with ADHD. And I just want to show you this pretty cool video that shows you the slow maturational development of a brain with ADHD compared to healthy controls. And you can look up here and see the ages as they go through. But hopefully you can see how the healthy controls, they just develop about 2.5 years earlier. And unfortunately, the kids with ADHD never fully catch up. So it's a pretty, and that's from these functional MRI studies. I'm going to show it one more time, but they're pretty stark. So what is ADHD? The term attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, I haven't even used it yet, is really a little bit of a sideshow. The attention, I think, is a sideshow, and the hyperactivity is a sideshow, or at least according to Russell Barkley, who again is kind of the leading researcher in this area. One of the things that he calls it is a self-regulation deficit disorder. And what do we mean by self-regulation? Self-regulation, this is one definition, is any action an individual directs at him or herself, so it's some self-directed action, so as to change his or her own behavior from what he or she might have otherwise done. So it's something to change the course of what they're doing. This is something that is more or less unique to humans, right? Most other animals don't think ahead and kind of redirect their behavior from their instincts. They just follow their instincts. In order to change the likelihood of a future consequence or attainment of a goal. It's this long-term thinking. It's a delay of gratification. It's thinking, ooh, I really want to have that cookie right now, but I'm going to quiet. Or I really want to call out right now because I have a good answer and I want to make everybody laugh, but I want to get in trouble. And so that's really what self-regulation is, and that's really what's difficult for kids with ADHD. And here's the one idea. So again, if you're going to tune me out, or go back to lunch or go back to your classrooms and your busy times during the day, I totally understand that, because there's all kinds of things happening in my school outside my door as well. But here's the one idea I'd love for you to hold on to, is that the core deficit, again, according to Russell Barkley in ADHD, is impulse control. Right here in the prefrontal cortex in the front of your brain is a control center. It is not the seat of your intelligence. All the knowledge and information and ideas are back here. What sits up front is kind of like the helm. And the helm brings all those ideas together and manages them. And one of the most important pieces of that helm is the brake. And you could imagine that a lot of times you have things that you want to do and you put the brake on. You're in the middle of teaching and you really have to go to the bathroom, but you're in the middle of teaching and teachers aren't allowed to go to the bathroom. So you're going to put the brake on and wait there for a minute, and hopefully get someone to cover your class in 5 or 10 minutes. Or someone says something that really upsets you, maybe they didn't even mean to, and you have a smart aleck or maybe a nasty response. You're like, I'm going to hold that back, and you put the foot on that brake. The brake is what's malfunctioning in a kid with ADHD. Not in all cases, not in all situations, but and they sometimes can use it. It's just weaker. It's like they have to slam on it harder, or it just fails. It's just, needs to be strengthened. And so when they have a smart alecky response, they usually say it. They forget to hold it back. When they really want to, cut the line because they're getting really bored because their brain is like, what's the next thing? They're going to just cut the line, or they're going to get really restless thinking that they want to. And if you take this basic idea with impulse control out, you can see how it underlies the problems that occur in all three of the major areas of ADHD, at least as defined by the DSM. So first, impulsivity. Well, that's the same. Obviously, that's it. But let's think about hyperactivity. If you're a little kid and your body just wants to go and there's no breaks saying sit, pay attention, read this book, you just bounce up. You have trouble sitting in your chair. That's impulsive movement. And if you have trouble paying attention, it's actually, kids with ADHD don't have trouble paying attention. They have trouble directing their attention. They actually pay attention quite well. They pay attention to everything. Those are the kids who, oh my God, who's coming in the room right now? And they totally get distracted from giving this presentation because that's impulsive attention. They're totally attending to what happened. Right now, I'm screening it out if someone walked into the room, but they're not able to, because their attention goes wherever it's interested at the moment. It's really drawn to the most salient thing. The most salient thing is the most interesting, the most novel, or the thing that they like. So one of the things that comes out of this is people say, well, my kid can't have ADHD because, when they play video games, they play for hours. But that makes perfect sense. In a kid with ADHD, their impulsive attention is that they follow where their attention is naturally pulled and aren't able to redirect it. I really, really love this, I really, really love this game and I want to keep playing it, but I'm supposed to do my reading. So a kid without ADHD is going to have a better time breaking and saying, okay, I'm going to stop this game and go read. Easier, not easy, but easier. Kid with ADHD, it's extremely difficult to pull them away from the thing they're interested in. And they'll just keep going and going and going and play Minecraft until 2 a.m. Because that break, that impulse control, where their attention is being drawn is looser. Now, in that way, you can also see how ADHD can be a great strength. A great proportion of stockbrokers who work on trading floors where it's noisy and people are making calls and they're making tons of money and they're, it's very exciting all the time and they have to make very quick decisions. A very great proportion of them have ADHD, and it's highly adaptive because they need to be able to direct their attention wherever is most salient at this moment and, move on. I couldn't do it. I would be overwhelmed. I'd be looking for where's the conference room for me to make a quiet phone call. I wouldn't be able to make the decisions quickly enough, but they have that impulsivity is really to their advantage in that setting. They could also lose a lot of money that way. But if they're, generally smart and generally doing the right thing, they can make a lot of money that way. Sports, a lot of people who play sports. The classic example is Michael Phelps. I love his example because Michael Phelps, who won eight gold medals in one Olympics, the best Olympian ever, is very public about his ADHD. Went off meds in high school, always struggled in school, had trouble paying attention. But around 10, when he got into swimming, one of the things he learned he had to do was to watch videos of himself swimming to improve his stroke. And he would spend hours staring at these extremely boring videos, or at least to me, boring videos of swimming, because he was really into it. He was really fascinated by it. He was motivated by it. And when everyone else was practicing 6 days a week, he practiced 7 days a week because he was just obsessed with it. He couldn't control his love for it. And that made him the greatest swimmer of all time. However, once he reached the point where he had kind of satisfied his goals and was, at the top of the world, and it was no longer so novel to get all these gold medals, he got bored. And if you listen to a recent interview with him, it's like ADHD talking. He's like, yeah, I'm not so into it anymore. And I've trouble kind of like, I only want to do it if I really want to do it. And I want to move on to other things, and I'll participate, but I'm not going to practice so much. Because before he reached that goal that he was so excited about, he was drawn in and couldn't control his, kind of impulsive focus on swimming. And now that he's kind of bored with it and done with it because he accomplished it, he doesn't feel challenged by it. He can't get himself together to do it so well. So it's just fascinating watching that play out in the public sphere, because that is a great example of that impulse control. I want to get more specific, but I want to actually give an opportunity if anyone wants to ask a question at this point to clarify kind of this core idea.
Please go ahead and unmute your line if you want to ask a question. Feel free to raise your hand or just jump in.
Or I've beaten a dead horse and we should move on. Sounds good to me. All right, if you have another question, you can always post it on the chat or wait till the end. All right, so let's just talk about, I have a little image here of self-regulation that I use with kids and with adults. So you start with any trigger. The trigger could be someone call me a name. Let's use anger as the feeling, right? So kid called me a name, I feel angry. That means that, I start feeling fire in my face and my heart starts beating. That's the body part. My thoughts are, oh, he's so mean. I don't like him anymore. And I'm so mad. So that's the feeling of anger. Where impulsivity comes in is that you just basically go from trigger to feeling to action without any thought. I'm going to hit him. I just did. I didn't even think about it. This happened so fast that I just hit him. Where self-regulation comes in is it helps you to manage the feeling. Maybe, okay, well, he called me a name, but, other times he's nice to me, or, what, he's not worth it. And, I'm going to take some breaths and I'm going to walk away because I don't want to do anything I don't want to do. And you're going to interrupt the action. Even more important than managing the feeling is interrupting this action. And that impulse control, that self-regulation, allows you to make a different choice. I'm going to walk away. I'm going to hang out with my friends. He's annoying. Or maybe he's my friend and I don't want to do anything to jeopardize our relationship. And later I'm going to come back to him and say, like, that was really mean. And he's going to actually apologize. Whatever the action is, with self-control, I can actually consciously make it. And this, without self-control, you basically lose that ability, and you're just acting on instinct. You're acting in response to feelings, which are essentially your motivational strength within your body. So that's really what we're dealing with self-regulation. Now, it doesn't have to just do with anger, although kids with ADHD tend to get angry more easily, or act on their anger more easily. It could do, with enjoyment. If you're excited, again, about that video game, your trigger is you see the computer, there's the iPad, I get all excited, I have to go play right now. So the feeling can be interchanged, but that trigger to action is harder to regulate. So going back to this, and I want to just, I'll just come back. I kind of already said these things, but if you look at the inattentive and hyperactive and impulsive symptoms, this poor sustained attention is, when they lack intrinsic appeal, they don't have stick-to-itiveness. They might start, but they can't stick with it because they're not drawn into it. They shift from one uncompleted activity to another. And they have trouble completing routine assignments without someone supervising and pushing them. But as I said before, they can sustain their attention unusually well when they're interested. When they're drawn into something, they can actually do it better and often, accomplish more than typical peers. So again, playing this out with this impulsivity around, inhibition, impulse control, delay of gratification, they react to events. They have trouble looking for long-term rewards, and they really have trouble with delay of gratification. And as we know from the studies, the marshmallow studies, we know what happens with kids with poor delay gratification. They do poor on the SATs. Kids who can't resist the marshmallow at 4, for those who remember the Walter Mischel studies from the 60s, their SAT scores are lower, their attainment in life is lower because they have trouble delaying their gratification. That's all this impulsivity. And the hyperactivity is this task-relevant movement, right? So it's the fidgeting and the rocking and the restlessness on the go. Although this declines with age, you'll find that teenagers and adults with ADHD usually are more restless and fidgety than their peers, which makes sense. So what are some areas, quickly I want to go through some areas of difficulty that kind of flow from these problems. So one that's not talked about a lot, but I find very, very consistently with kids with ADHD that I work with is time blindness. They really don't have a sense of how long things take, and they really don't have a sense of waiting 5 minutes or waiting an hour, or waiting 2 days. It's very hard for them to wait. They don't have a sense of how long to schedule for things, how long things should take, and they don't have ability to wait for things. A really interesting study on this was the following. Imagine that we all have what we call a reinforcement gradient. So if I said to you, look, you really like cookies? Fantastic. I'll give you 1 cookie today, but if you wait an hour, I'll give you 2 cookies. Well, you might say, all right, I really want those cookies. They're really awesome. I'll wait an hour. Well, what if I said to you, I'll give you 1 cookie an hour, wait a day? All right, I might still wait a day. What if I said at 1 cookie an hour, wait a year? You're like, forget it. At some point, even though 2 cookies is better than 1, even if you're pretty much guaranteed to get them, it's not worth it. It's not worth the wait. We all have that reinforcement gradient. Things that are immediate are much more reinforcing than things that are distal, things that are further away. Kids with ADHD have a certain time compression where they have trouble with that. So for them, if I don't get it right now, the difference between, 5 minutes from now is too long to wait, let alone an hour, let alone a day. And then you can see how delay of gratification is so difficult because they have their reinforcement gradient is much steeper. In other words, they are much more likely to take the lower amount of reinforcement now rather than the larger amount of reinforcement, even in 5 minutes, let alone 2 days. You can see how difficult it would be to get a PhD, or how difficult it would be to clean your room, even though at the end you're going to get rewarded with extra TV time, or how it would be difficult to remember the consequence when calling out right now gets everyone to laugh. Because calling out right now is so much more valuable. I didn't even think about the long-term consequence of getting in trouble or whatever. And so that immediacy of the reinforcement is so much more powerful. And that's what makes intervening with ADHD so difficult, is that there's immediate bang for the buck in so many things that they do. Kids with ADHD don't do things at random, mostly. I mean, not more than any other kid. They usually, their behaviors are goal-directed, even if they don't know what they are. But they're goal-directed in a very impulsive and haphazard and immediate way. So they have trouble delaying it. So, and attention seeking is probably one of the most common things that they do, but they have trouble remembering that there's a long-term goal they might want, that their immediate attention seeking in class, calling out, being silly, yelling out the answer, butting into a conversation is really going to interfere with. Other areas of difficulty are deficits in working memory. You can imagine how if your brain is very impulsive and jumping around, it doesn't hold things in mind very well. So it makes, math, for example, can be hard. Not for all kids. Some kids love math, and so all of a sudden their working memory grows when they focus on it, because that's what their ADHD is pulling them to do. But typically their working memory for many things is smaller, particularly around language. And the development of internal language is also hampered. And to the extent that we need internal language to modify our behavior and self-regulate, the lack of internal language or the delay in internal language makes that more difficult, or maybe underlies the problem. They have trouble with regulating their emotions or motivation and arousal. If you have any doubts of that, I don't know if you read Calvin and Hobbes. I certainly did, but this is a fairly textbook case of difficulty with modifying his level of emotion and motivation and arousal. Less flexible in problem solving. I really want to do it this way. My brain is pulling me towards this. It's very hard for me to shift to your idea or to do it differently or to wait because of that. And this is really important to remember. Kids with ADHD are consistently inconsistent. What the trap that kids with ADHD have is that they tend to be, they're as bright as anybody else, on the spectrum, on the bell curve of everybody else. They can have great strengths, and they can perform almost anything you want them to do. They can do it sometimes. The problem is that their performance is inconsistent, and that's because their brain is pulling them in all different directions. When they're motivated, when they're interested, they might do it quite well. But other times, they impulsively get pulled in another direction. And then we blame them. We say, oh, Well, he did it yesterday. He should be able to do it today. What I say a lot with kids with ADHD is when people say, can this kid sit for 45 minutes? I said, he can, but he probably can't do it consistently. He can do it sometimes. It depends on the task. But to ask him to do that all day in all different subjects is unlikely. And how do we manage that? So consistently inconsistent, something to remember. Here's some kind of problems that we know are highly correlated. So when you're looking at a kid with ADHD, you're generally not looking at a kid with just ADHD. Many, if not most of them, have oppositional defiant disorder, which usually appears mostly at home, but can appear in school too, in terms of just saying no and being negative. Some have conduct problems, which are even more difficult. About 50% of the kids have learning disabilities. We see that in our school, certainly. Tic disorders, low self-esteem, and depression. By the way, kids with ADHD don't have high rates of depression when they're little. They only seem to have depression in reaction to the world that's so difficult for them. So it's not an endogenous depression, any more so than the typical population. It's really in reaction. They have a high rate of bipolar disorder, antisocial personality, which is not too good, substance abuse. They have less schooling and lower grades. Much lower rates of graduating from college, 5% to 41%. It's pretty amazing. Very few of them reach professional job statuses. In our community, when this is kind of like the sine qua non of education, this is a real problem. They have poor occupational outcomes. They tend to be self-employed. You can imagine how they have trouble listening to other people's little kids. They have trouble listening to people as adults, and they want to do their own thing. They tend to be fired more often and change jobs more frequently. They have much more accidents, car accidents. When we talk to parents of teenagers about medication, and I say, look, I know medication is not an ideal solution, but do you want your kid driving in a car with that brain? That's a real question. More ER visits, more accidental poisonings, that impulsive, ooh, let me see, I'll drink that. More relationship issues, both between their friends. Their parents tend to have higher divorce rates, and their parents tend to have higher divorce rates. They're more likely to use alcohol and drugs, as I said before, more likely legal involvement. A huge proportion of people incarcerated have ADHD. 4 times the likelihood of acquiring an STD. You can imagine how impulsivity plays into that. They tend to be more overweight. We think of our ADHD kids as being, these skinny little things who never eat. But when you get older and you don't move around as much, it's harder to manage your weight. If you're like, ooh, I really want that right now, and I'm not going to be able to delay gratification to stick with my diet. And they have a shorter life expectancy. Look, these kids are everywhere. I want to paint the picture that this is that every kid is an inevitable tragedy. They're absolutely not. And these kids have a lot of strengths, including strengths that are flowing from the same place their ADHD is flowing from. But when looking at that picture, it certainly gives a lot of impetus for us to really think about how to intervene. I'm going to take one little side note and talk about ADHD and attentive type. As I said before, the hyperactive impulsive group probably does not exist alone. So there's ADHD combined. That's most of the kids we've been talking about until now. But there's also this ADHD and attentive type. This are the girls who sit in the back of the class. They don't call out. They're not always girls, but they're they don't disrupt. But they're in the clouds. They have no idea what's going on. Many of those kids are probably just either former or subthreshold combined types. They're just not so wiggly, but they're otherwise the same thing underneath it. They just are expressing it differently. Girls often express it differently, we think, because of the different social norms around being a girl, not necessarily because they have any less ADHD. But a portion of those kids probably have something totally different, which has been termed sluggish cognitive tempo, and it's getting a new name apparently because people don't like that term. It doesn't mean that they're any dumber, by the way, and that's one of the reasons they don't like this term. It just means that their brain kind of moves slower. And this is what's sluggish. This is not in the DSM. This is not official. This is really just being explored as a possibility. But here are some of the things that these kids seem to do. And this is, again, and you can see how this is not really the same kid as a kid with typical ADHD that we think about. And so you got to look for these kids in your school too and realize that although they may be identified as ADHD or they may be unidentified because they're sitting quietly and they're very nice, they need support as well. And their support's different. And by the way, speaking of medication again, they don't respond to medication the same way. They don't typically sound very well. Medication is only mildly beneficial for this group. So they're slow moving, lethargic. They make a lot of errors when they do stuff. They have trouble with memory. They're kind of mentally foggy, daydreamy, spacey. They have difficulty with selective attention. That's really the same as ADHD, but they're much more passive and quiet. and apprehensive, which is not typical of ADHD for the combined type kids mostly. There's much less impulsivity. There's not a high rate of behavior problems. These are kind of quiet kids. And their risk is less for the language-based learning disability. They have more trouble with math LD, anxiety and depression. So just an interesting side group to keep your eye on and to think maybe differently about. Let's talk about treatment for a minute, and then we'll get into some practical suggestions. And I'm just keeping an eye on the time to make sure we have time for some questions. The first thing is education advocacy. You might have been expecting medication up there, but I think that understanding how the kid's brain works when they have ADHD gives you a lot of rahmanis. It really gives you a lot of you're able to really empathize with this child's predicament, and that really allows you to advocate for them and also hold them accountable, but hold them accountable in a way that's going to help them grow their capacities and their skills rather than just get them frustrated. But to this point, and there's a lot of controversy around this, the overwhelming finding, and I say this as a psychologist, not a psychiatrist, I cannot prescribe drugs, is that medication is the frontline treatment for the core symptoms of inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. It's not the core treatment for the other kind of functional things that happen, the learning, the oppositional defiant disorder, the anxiety, the depression, and all the other difficulties. But medication is just far more effective than anything we psychologists have come up with, partially because the medication happens to be particularly effective. It's probably the most effective class of medications in psychiatry, with a very low side effect profile. At the same time, no one likes putting kids on meds. So it just has to be in there. It has to be part of the conversation. Behavioral interventions, again, don't seem to get at the core impulsivity. It's too fast. But what they do is they help with the functioning in school with oppositional behaviors. There's summer treatment programs that are very helpful in that area. Organizational skills training can be helpful. There's a really great study that was put out by the NYU Child Study Center a year or two ago. They've put out a program for kids with ADHD and organizational skills deficits in grades 3 to 5. And you can buy their manual on Amazon. The lead author is Richard Gallagher. They found really strong effect sizes with this program. For those people who know, like 1.2, effect size of 1.2, which is really tremendous. So this can really be taught, which is fantastic. We do that, by the way, within our program. It's one of the things we build into our program for all of our kids. Social skills training is hard because you teach it over there, and then they have to do it when they're feeling impulsive in the middle of the social situation. So it's very hard to generalize it. So the closer it can be to the point of performance, of more like in school, and is really coached in school and prompted in school, then you have some possibility that social skills training will work. But social skills training does not have a great research history. We have to do it because we got to help the kids somehow, but we don't have a strong model yet of what social skills training should look like. Treatments treatments don't seem to cure. They really manage a chronic condition. So they need to be sustained. Medication classically, when you take it, all those bad things I told you about car accidents and higher rates of drug abuse, they all go down to baseline levels when a kid is appropriately managed with medication. But the moment they come off of it, there might be a little bit of support because they're on a better track, but there's not a ton of it. So it's really something that you have to consider chronically if you're going to start it. I'm just looking at your comments here. All right, here's the stimulant medications. I'm not going to go through them, and then, but you can use this as a reference. There's one new one that came out recently that's not on this list, and I'm blanking on the name. Here are some non-stimulants. They don't work as well, but sometimes they're used as an adjunct or when the stimulants can't be taken. The most popular one right now is Intuitive. It's intended release. Guanfacine is originally for blood pressure, but it's somewhat helpful for some kids. So these don't have great outcomes at the moment. Neurofeedback CogMed is one kind of neurofeedback program, and fish oil, there's possibly some support for it. It's still just not well supported by the literature, and there have been too many negative studies, and there's too many studies where nothing worked. And these other things can be great for other reasons, but don't seem to get at ADHD in particular. Mindfulness is great practice, and there's great benefits to it, but we haven't seen it help with the core symptoms of ADHD. Special diets are helpful when kids have an intolerance for something, but they don't seem to get at plain old ADHD, and so on and so forth. So, what to do in the classroom? Just going to see if you have any All right, I'm going to come back to your questions a little bit at the end. Oh, what do you mean by internal language? I'll answer that one quickly. Internal language is think about how you think. Be a little metacognitive at the moment. And it's you talk to yourself all the time. And that's how you direct, oh, I think I'm going to go over there. And sometimes you intentionally talk to yourself like, come on, Yoni, be confident. You can give this talk. You've given this talk a million times before. So what if it's the first time you're giving a webinar? So that internal language is slowed in kids with ADHD, and you can see how that's a really important tool in self-regulating. But if it's not there, it's harder for them to learn it. It's hard for them to do it. And do you know anything about learning prescription, learning diagnoses? I'm not sure what that question was. Let me come back to it at the end. All right, managing a classroom. Here are the basic tenets, and then we'll get a little more specific. Best practice is only more so. Kids with ADHD, they don't need necessarily something very different, but they need it done well. They really need it tight. Tight classroom management, well-run classrooms can be one of the most amazing things for kids with ADHD because they know the structure, they know the framework, and they're able to follow it. And it can really foresaw a lot of other problems. The other thing is to really think about your relationship. The famous study that I always love to cite is by a very interesting Jewish guy, John Gottman, who is a professor at University of Washington in Seattle. He's the most prolific researcher of couples. And what he found is that couples that have a one-to-one correspondence, one-to-one relationship between their positive interactions and their negative interactions, those couples tend to get divorced. Now, John Gottman has the distinction of being able to predict divorce 5-year rate, 5 years from the point he studies you, being able to predict your rate of divorce with something like 94, 96% accuracy, which is a little freaky. But no, psychologists generally don't do anything with 94, 96% accuracy. But one piece of his formula is the rate of positive to negative interactions. In order to have a positive relationship that's going to be stable over the long term in a kind of family environment, the relationship needs to be about 5 to 1. So you got to think now about your most difficult student, whether they have ADHD or not, and think, what would it take for me? Now I have to correct some behavior, so I'm going to have some negative interactions, but what would it take for me to have a 5 to 1 positive to negative relationship with this kid in order to really draw them in? One of the studies that I read that was amazing is that Boys Town in Nebraska, where I did my dissertation, it's this amazing place where throwaway teenagers from all over the country come, and they live in this community together, and they have this amazing kind of intervention program with these kids and really, does a great job with them. One of their pieces that they do is this intentional 5 to 1. And when they do this 5 to 1, it helps a lot of the kids. What they found for this one set of kids is all their interventions, the millions of things they were doing weren't working. So they actually ratcheted it up from 5 to 1 to 8 or 9 to 1. And they found these kids who'd spent their whole lives having people treat them negatively, that helped them to turn around. So think about what it would take for you to be more positive with these kids before you do anything else, before you set those limits. They need to be taught social emotional skills. Social emotional learning in the school is just key. And that's key for all kids and these kids in particular. And the classroom management structure, like I said, and specific support we'll get to. So I'm just looking at the time. Let me just show a couple of slides and give you some basic ideas, and then you can peruse the kind of other suggestions as I answer some questions. So some ideas for classroom structure. This is not a progressive classroom as you know it. More of a closed space, minimize visual distractions, face desk forward. When kids, one of the things that people say about the group clusters that most classrooms have nowadays is that, there's virtually no other time when we sit across from someone that we're not supposed to speak to them. We're sitting them in coffee clutches, and then we expect them to turn their bodies and to pay attention to something else. Now, that's a great environment to do group work and should be done in that setting. But to pay attention to a lecture or to interact with a teacher who's doing direct instruction, it's not ideal. So to really think about that, and kids with ADHD really struggle with this. Establishing routines the first 2 to 6 weeks. I have a whole other talk on classroom management, which I won't do now. But really thinking about that, and also thinking about things like switching your tasks frequently, really thinking about your pace. They actually need less transition time in certain ways, and increased pace because they want to move. They got to keep moving to the next thing. Frequent reminders of rules. Use your intention as a reinforcer. You know, kids are really motivated by the teacher's attention. So really make sure that you're attending mostly to the positive, and that's going to draw up more positive. And to the extent that you can ignore the negative. My wife is a second grade teacher at a RAVSAK school, Kinneret, and she has a very strict rule in second grade in her classroom of 25 kids, which is that if you call out, you are disqualified from participating for 5 minutes of the conversation. Well, so these little second graders, a fair number of whom have ADHD, just like everybody else, by the third or fourth week of school, there's not any calling out anymore. They realize they're not getting anything from it. There's no bang for the buck. They're not getting the reinforcement of the attention that they're seeking. And so they're not, you know, kids with ADHD aren't just haphazard. They really respond to that. They just respond impulsively. But if it's not working for them, it's not working for them. And if you can be really, really strict about that and really just, what's 2 + 2? And one kid yells out 4. And then another kid raises their hand and you say, yes, Yanko, what is it? 4. Oh, 4. Thank you very much. As if the other one never said anything. That kid who called out, you might have to remind them once or twice, will learn, oh, wait, I want to say 4. I want to get the answer in. I better raise my hand. Now they'll raise it like, but then you're shaping them in the right direction. So here are just some principles that that we've kind of talked about, most of them until this point. And what exists for the rest of this, most of the rest of the slides that I won't go into now, are really how you do a functional behavioral analysis. How do you think about antecedent interventions before the behavior that's a problem with a kid with ADHD, and how do you do consequence interventions afterwards, and a little bit more about self-regulation. But I'm going to take a pause now and I know we don't have a lot of time, but a few minutes for questions, and I hope that you'll take the time to look at some of the other slides afterwards.
Yoni, thank you so much. If anybody wants to raise their hand, you can find that little hand raising function to let me know that you want to talk, or just unmute your line and jump in. Any thoughts or questions?
I have a question.
Please go ahead. Is that Ellen Kohlauer talking?
Yes, ma'am.
Great.
How would you best recommend to support regular classroom teachers in supporting these kids with ADHD? That's the situation I'm in. I'm the learning specialist, so my job partly is to go and teach teachers how to then implement these things that they're talking about. And it was so great to hear you really go in depth into these characteristics of kids, because so many times it's just assumed that, oh, well, they're just impulsive. But all the other things that go into it, it was just fabulous.
So, I mean, I always start with trying to get understanding, which I think understanding the underlying kind of architecture of what's going on, I think leads to 2 important things that we in education, we skip to practical, but there's 2 important things with understanding that I think are important. One is empathy. It's very, very hard to work with these kids. It's challenging. And so that empathy, we have to really just double down on that empathy. And the other piece is that if you can start to understand the pattern, so it doesn't look like it's haphazard, so you can start to see the predictability. So you start to think, wait, why does he keep doing the same thing over and over, even when I tell him not to? Then you can be much more thoughtful about what your intervention is. And I'll come back to attention seeking because it's really the classic example. When a kid calls out and we say to the kid, shh, remember to raise your hand, they hear you and they might agree with you, but all you've done is given them attention for calling out. So underlying that is you've actually reinforced the exact behavior you're trying to extinguish. Right. So one of the things you can do is go into the classroom and really watch I'm sure you go in and you do observations of these teachers and really give them feedback in terms of how they're interacting with these kids. And is that really pulling them with this kind of brain towards better behavior, better engagement, being able to do it? Or is it just making it really hard for them to do so? Are they not chunking their directions well enough so the kids forget what the 3rd and 4th directions were? Are they, a whole list of things. And that's where you start to realize, if you can, again, think about how their brains work, that starts to modify how you interact with them, I think.
Right. And before I go, I just want to say thank you so much. And I really, really like the 5-to-1 interaction. So that's the very first thing I'm going to try to implement. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yoni, Donna Hamilton has typed in a question in the chat box.
Sure.
It's at the very bottom, a 6th grade female student.
A 6th grade female student. I have to say I don't know enough about that protocol. Fibromyalgia is a complicated diagnosis. It's very hard to make. It's a little bit controversial. I think pretty much most people are on board with it at this point. And I would say that's probably unrelated to the ADHD part, although one might say that the ADHD inattentive symptoms usually may be secondary to the fact that this kid's probably really uncomfortable a lot of the time, so it's probably really hard for him to pay attention. But I'm sorry I don't know much more about that protocol.
Any other last thoughts or questions?
I'm glad I answered everything for you.
Oh, sorry. We have two quick questions. The first one is a lot of our teachers do like go noodle in the middle of class. I'm wondering if you think that's an effective way to sort of help the students with ADHD get a little energy out. If there's specific times you think that would be more effective or less effective.
I think movement breaks are very helpful. And I think you just have to be very thoughtful and use them very judiciously. So you have to really figure out, how you're pacing your lessons, where's an appropriate time to break. And you also, one of the things I didn't talk about is that I really think that one of the things that builds up self-regulation capacity and executive functioning is holding kids appropriately accountable for things, not telling them that they're doing it wrong, but actually having real life consequences so they can start to think for themselves. So one of the things that I see in our schools, we do lots of movement breaks, and I think that's very important. But when kids are not behaving appropriately with them, we stop them or we skip them or we do something else that's less favored. And I think you get a lot of buy-in when you really are like, you're kind of handing a little bit of the ownership over for that necessary process to the kid. So I would really be thoughtful about combining those two pieces.
Okay, and then our other question was, yesterday we actually visited a place called Learning RX, and there, have you heard of it before? Okay. So we were just wondering your opinion on it, but I guess since it's like they retrain the parts of the brain, and so it's supposed to be helpful for students with ADHD, but.
So the research on it at the moment, so they might have, look, we don't know. It could be that they have found the solution that we all hope that someone will find, which is that there's some neurofeedback way to train the brain and to really strengthen the prefrontal cortex and other areas that are impacted without medication and in a way that'll generalize. Typically, the research has found with many, many interventions, and the problem is they kind of crop up all the time, so it's like a million weeds and you don't know which ones are the good ones. Generally, when they're rigorously studied, they are effective in that setting. So what happens is if you teach a kid to memorize longer and longer strings of numbers, in other words, you're training their working memory, they can memorize longer and longer strings of numbers. They cannot memorize longer and longer strings of letters, let alone more pieces of verbal information that are actually valuable. So the challenge with those is really to see whether they have good data on whether it generalizes outside of their setting. Do they actually see an impact in a real classroom on specific target behaviors, not on the things that they're specifically training?
Dr. Yoni Schwab, I can't thank you enough for this compelling, intriguing, really, really hands-on understanding of ADHD and some suggested interventions. Everyone on the line, a secret that you don't know is that Dr. Yoni Schwab is a part of the Learning Specialist Reshet here at RAVSAK. So you guys can continue this conversation online. I will respectfully protect the assistant head of school's time and tell you that he won't be able to answer every question most likely, but please feel free to continue the conversation through that Reshet online. Yoni Schwab, thank you. It is such an honor to have you. I will do my best to have this recording edited and sent out. You should please feel free to share it with your faculty. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Yoni, thank you. It's truly, truly a pleasure.
Thank you, Deborah, for inviting me, and thank you to everyone who found an hour in the middle of the day to listen to me. Thanks. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. You too.